This is the lecture video 713 through 727, Great Depression into the New Deal. Stock market crashes. And what you need to remember is that there was a lot of things that were leading up to the Great Depression and the stock market crash. There is no single cause of the Great Depression. It's a number of things. The stock market crash signals the beginning of the Great Depression. We had a huge unequal distribution of wealth. The majority of the people didn't have their money in the stock market. So when the stock market crashed, people lost money, and it was bad for the economy, yes, but it's the fallout from that, when the Great Depression starts, that's the problem. Because most people are living below the subsistence level, they don't have money in the stock market. Some of the other reasons for the Great Depression, the domination of the economy by oligopolies. We talked about that rule of the economy by a few, which kept artificial prices high and rigid. Weaknesses in our main things: agriculture, coal, textile, and we didn't regulate banks or manage them at all. I mean, remember, we get rid of regulation, and when the Republicans started to get rid of regulation, things are going to end up getting bad at some point. International economics was also bad. Remember, we are the creditor nation, and when we lose and we don't have the money, now the other countries in the world don't have the money, and it becomes a worldwide Great Depression. By 1930, industrial production had plummeted, and by 32, it was at 50% of the 29 level. And by 32, 1/4 of the labor force was unemployed, and personal income dropped by over half. I mean, 1/4 of the labor force is unemployed. The Great Depression's a really hard time. I mean, Texas shuts down schools for an entire year. Well, I'd be screwed. My wife and I would both lose our jobs because the schools would shut down. I would lose my house. I don't have a year's worth of bills saved up. Well, that would be great, but I don't. So that lies the problem. Farmers are hit hard. Commodity prices fell 55%. Foreclosures and evictions go through the roof. Urban families end up having to move into shanty towns, which they name Hoovervilles after Hoover because they think Hoover doesn't help them out. Most of these shanty towns were near water. Spring Lake Park was a massive Hooverville or a massive shanty town. Soup kitchens become common. People going and getting food. Living with not a lot. Kids who were of a certain age would run away so they wouldn't be a burden on their families. Here's the unemployment numbers that we talked about in class. This is a Hooverville or a shantytown in Seattle, and you can see they just use whatever things they can to build their little shack out of. Women were affected in really weird ways. They're concentrated in low-paying jobs, so they're less likely to be fired. But if you're married, then they fired the married women because the married women's husbands, in their thinking, have jobs. They did not get hired for traditional male jobs, but did displace men as teachers, social workers, and librarians. Families experienced great strain. I mean, you can imagine. I mean, one of the leading causes for divorce, even now, has to do with money. And when there's no money and there's high stress, things happen. But divorces actually decline in the Great Depression because they can't afford to pay for the divorces. So basically, people just go their separate ways. Husbands and fathers are often humiliated and despondent when fired from their jobs, and a lot of them leave, go to big towns, and just never come back. Women's responsibilities grew. The number of female-headed household increased. Some women became wage earners, and others expanded household duties to lower expenses and raise money. You did whatever you had to do. Women made girls' dresses out of 50-pound flour sacks. And when the company realized that women were doing this, they started printing flowers and patterns and certain things on their flour bags so that the girls would have some dresses that looked different than just brown. You'd sell eggs, anything you had to do to make an extra buck. Children not only felt the tension and fear, but they went hungry. Some, just imagine not going to school. I mean, not going to college because there's no student loans, there's no government grants, your parents don't have any money, you can't go. Some just stop going to high school, they leave home to try to find a job somewhere. Just jump on a train, go. Family conflicts increased as hopes faded. Racial minorities were often the last hired and first fired, so they're less able to weather the economic plane. Black unemployment rates doubled those of white, and racism limited the assistance African Americans received. By 1932, most African Americans are suffering acute privation, acute not having anything. I mean, it's way worse on them than it is on white people. Hispanic Americans, they're like, man, we came here to have better economic opportunities. Bye, we're going back to Mexico. 500,000 Mexican immigrants and their American-born children leave the United States in the 1930s. And just, if I got to endure economic hardship, I might as well be near home. Here's the picture that we discussed in class. Most Americans did not protest the hard times, and they blamed themselves for their plight. I mean, a lot of them, it's their fault. They rack up these huge bills they can't pay for, and they have nothing. Communists, socialists, and other radical groups organized formal protests, including staging marches, demonstrating for relief, and blocking evictions. Rural protests also erupted, and communists organized some protests, but others are more formal, mostly having to do with farming and the like. Hoover. What does Hoover do? Hoover fought the Depression more vigorously than any other past president, but unfortunately, even though he does do a lot, it's not enough. And he prefers a volunteer private relief over government action. He said, man, people need to just get it from organizations. All these places that you've donated to in your life, go get stuff from them. And he wants corporate cooperation to do this, but they're all just trying to make a buck too. They're not going to make less money. That's not the idea of having a business. Voluntary relief efforts fell short, and he vetoed a congressional plan to aid the unemployed. He comes up with the idea of Americans need to pull themselves up by the bootstraps. They need to do it themselves. The Depression worsened. Hoover pushed through a tax cut, established the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, to fund recovery through government loans. But the problem is that's not enough. Just not enough. In 1932, World War I veterans march on Washington, D.C. There they want their bonuses. They did not get pay for being on active duty, and they want their money. And they're not supposed to get their money until 1945, but they march on Washington and erect 10,000 homes, shanty homes, near the White House. And in the beginning, Hoover sends them water and food and waits for Congress to make a decision. And I mean, you can imagine, yeah, they're not due this money until 1945, but when you have nothing, you want your money now. Well, once Congress decides that they're not going to allow the money to be given early, Hoover tells General Douglas MacArthur, who will be super famous in World War II and beyond, he tells them to get rid of the bonus army. Well, he doesn't exactly tell them how to do it, and unfortunately, he goes like basically full military on our old World War I veterans, rolls in tanks, firebombs them, and there's of course outrage from everybody. Hoover's not going to win the 1932 election because of what he did with the bonus army. I mean, you can see here, I mean, a picture only tells a moment in time, but how we talked about it in class, I mean, it's just crazy how Hoover allowed our military to attack our World War I veterans, It symbolized his unpopularity. Hoover refused to meet with the veterans, and the public was outraged at their treatment. The Republicans nominated Hoover while the Democrats chose FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or Roosevelt, as some might say, who promised a New Deal for Americans. Though Roosevelt spoke in vague terms, he won in a landslide election. He really doesn't have a plan. He's like, yeah, we're going to come up with this New Deal. We're going to come up with something, but he really doesn't talk about it. And then once he gets elected in November, and then he has till January to kind of figure out what the heck he's going to do. And you can see here, he smokes Hoover. In his first 100 days in office, Roosevelt passed a large body of legislation called its first 100 days. Banking crisis is the first thing. The banks were closed on Saturday and on Sunday, and he closed them on Monday and said, if your bank opens up again on actually it was Friday, Saturday, Sunday. If your bank opens up again on Monday, then your bank's good. Stop running towards the banks. Stop trying to take the money from the banks. And people actually listen to him. He gets on the radio and addresses America with what's called the fireside chats, where he basically talks to people in their vernacular, in how they understand it. Most of the time, presidents, when they speak, most Americans don't understand what they're saying. But Roosevelt chooses to speak in terms that they will understand. He also launches the Glass-Steagall Act, which reformed the financial industry, which creates the Securities and Exchange Commission, which the Securities and Exchange Commission regulates the stock market. Other measures included the Homeowners Loan Corporation and the Farm Credit Administration. The FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which guarantees your money in the bank. If your bank fails, you get up to a certain amount of money. And here are the first 100-day different laws that came into place. You need to know the law. You need to know its abbreviation and what it did. So like the second one down is the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act. Okay, the AAA, Agricultural Adjustment Act, established a farm recovery program based on production controls and price support. Okay, the NIRA, or NIRA, the National Industrial Recovery Act, established a national recovery program and authorized a public works program. If you don't know these backwards and forwards, you're going to be in trouble. Okay, all of these are super important. And there's more of them that we're going to talk about in this chapter. So be ready. The CCC, the FDIC, the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority. I mean, all of these are important. Okay, so please make sure you know these. They're called the alphabet soup laws of FDR. And that was the lecture, reading lecture for pages 713 through 727.